Hello, all, and welcome to Bennis Stories, a series of interviews with people who knew, loved, were influenced by, worked with, wrote with, were students and mentees of Warren Bennis. This is Kate Bennis, Warren's daughter. This series is created for the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati's Lindner College of Business. My partner in this endeavor is Betsy Myers. Betsy was a dear friend and colleague of Dad's, worked with him at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government as its executive director. She has also been a senior advisor to both President Clinton and President Obama. Today, Betsy and I are delighted to welcome Linda Hill. Linda is the Wallace Brett Donham Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School and faculty chair of the Leadership Initiative. She is co-author of Collective Genius, the Art and Practice of Leading Innovation, and co-founder of Paradox Strategies, and co-creator of the Innovation Quotient, Reroute and Remind. Hill co-founded Innovation Force, using AI and machine learning to accelerate the process of innovation. It was named by Fast Company as a 2023 and 2024 Innovative Company to Watch. She was named by Thinkers 50 as one of the top 10 management thinkers in the world in 2013 and 2021, and received the Thinkers 50 Innovation Award in 2015. Hill's book, Collective Genius, has also been named to the inaugural Thinkers 50 book list, 10 Management Classics for 2022. And it was also named by Business Insider as one of the 20 best business books and received a gold medal for the leadership at Axiom Business Book Award. Hill's TED Talk on how to manage for collective creativity has more than 2.9 million views. In 2015, Hill, along with her co-authors, received the first Warren Bennis Prize for the Harvard Business Review article Collective Genius based on the book. Her books and articles have been translated into multiple languages. She is now co-authoring a book, Genius at Scale: How do Great Leaders Drive Innovation, that will be published in early 2026, something to look forward to, which introduces the three roles of leading innovation at scale across organizations and ecosystems: architect, bridger, and catalyst. And we will learn way more about this in this conversation. We are delighted to welcome Linda Hill. Hi, Linda. Hi, Betsy. We are so excited to have you. I can't tell you. I have been a fan of yours for a long time, and I know that my dad was a fan of yours too.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to be able to speak about your father because he meant a whole lot to me. And actually, I'm going to talk about him in the present tense. He means a whole lot to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I think you were at his 2006 celebration of his life.
Yes, in fact, we paid for him to be at Harvard. The Leadership Initiative, of which I'm the chair, he was visiting Harvard Business School.
Let's just start right there with this Leadership Institute and this Leadership Initiative and bringing Dad in. And tell me, how did that all start?
I actually met your father at his home in Venice, on Venice Beach. So, because of Jolene Godfrey, who is a friend of mine and I think a friend of yours, I was out in LA for some reason, and Jolene said, "You have to meet my friend Warren Bennis." And I said, "Of course, I would love to meet Warren because I had read his work and knew about him." And so he was kind enough to invite me to his beautiful home. And of course, as you recall, it was like all white. So I thought, please don't serve me something that I can spill. So I did soon become quite comfortable and had a lovely, I think it was a lunch, actually. At that time, I was just finishing up Becoming a Manager, my very first book, and we had a conversation about it. And I remember he seemed to know about it more than I thought he should. So I must confess, I think that your father was one of the people who was asked to do the review for my tenure at Harvard Business School, because otherwise I'm not sure why he should have had it at that early date. And I don't know that he thought that through, but I thought, well, wonder why he knows about this so much. But anyhow, that's a guess. I never asked him.
Oh, that's such a great mystery.
When he was reflecting back to me what I wrote about in Becoming a Manager, I thought, oh, you seem to have seen some of this or some of it. And I was trying to think, well, maybe John Cotter gave it to him, or Richard Hackman was the other person who'd been reading it along the way, or maybe he was just asked to review it by Harvard Business Press at the time because they were trying to figure out whether they wanted to publish it.
Can I go back to Jolene? How do you know Jolene?
Well, I know Jolene because we had a common friend, and I didn't know Jolene at the time, but this common friend introduced us. We had dinner one night, and I needed to write a case about what does it take to be a perfect protege? Because I was writing a note called Beyond the Myth of the Perfect Mentor. And when Jolene described to me what she was working on and how she was working on it and who was helping her out, I thought, oh, she was being an entrepreneur, I thought at the time. This is when she was at Polaroid. And I said, may I write a case up about you? At first, it was just going to be a short piece to go with this note, but then I ended up being so fascinated by her that we actually wrote a case.
Tell us more about your work and your research.
I dare not say, obviously, your father had a very different career path than me. He went and he actually led something, led a university, etc. But the reason I wrote Becoming a Manager, I will be real honest with you. I have a PhD in behavioral sciences, and I had taken a few business courses at the University of Chicago, but not very many. And then I came to Harvard Business School and did a postdoc and became quite fascinated with this whole thing about business. I was interested in organizations. And so I did this postdoc with John Kotter, who was writing about leadership versus management, something that obviously your father wrote about too. And I had to teach MBAs. So I thought, oh my goodness, how do MBAs even learn to lead? What am I doing? What is this course I'm teaching? So I went to the library because I'm an academic to find out what is it all about. Now, John had written a book on general managers. But what happened was, it turns out there was very little research on how people learn to lead. And so I decided I would just do some interviews at first to figure out, well, what am I trying to teach these people and how are they going to learn it? Because I studied learning theory in college. I should tell you that. I studied comparative psychology. So I've always been interested in learning. And then I went to the University of Chicago and my interest ballooned. And so because I had to go in and teach MBAs, I thought, uh-oh, I better read about how they learn and what they need to know. And when I realized after doing some of these interviews and looking in the library, there really was very limited academic research on how people learn to lead. So I began to think that maybe what I would do is write a book on how people learn to lead. And so Becoming a Manager was the result of me needing to understand, frankly, what my role was going to be as a business professor and trying to prepare people to lead. And one quick thing I would say about it, and this is where your father also made a difference to me, I wasn't a very big believer in leadership in the following way. I actually believe that our environment shapes us a lot. And that, yes, we as individuals make a difference. And of course, you want people to have agency and all of that. But it wasn't until I became a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation invested in individual leaders, that I forced myself to really think about what is the role of the leader. Even though I'm telling you, I did this Becoming a Manager, and it was called Becoming a Manager. I knew John was talking about this distinction between leadership and management, but I called it Becoming a Manager because these were first-time managers. And at the same time, I was a little suspicious of just how important is that individual as compared to the other environmental factors that are really pushing and pulling on them to behave in different ways. And I really struggled with that for a long time, even when I became the chair of the Leadership Initiative and also the course head for our required leadership course. So I think what was interesting to me, and in talking to your father and reading his work, he thought leaders really mattered. So in some ways, I deeply respected his work, how he thought, etc. Obviously, John Kotter believed that too. And so I'm thinking, okay, how does all of this fit? But at the same time, I'm trying to understand, how do people learn to do whatever this is? So when I wrote Becoming a Manager, one person who wrote me a very nice note was Henry Mintzberg. And what he loved about it is I called it Becoming a Manager, not Becoming a Leader, because Henry's real big on management. And I am too. And I do understand the distinction between leadership and management. They were moving into a managerial role. That's what it was called, all of the leaders that I studied. And that's what that was about. And I understood this distinction between the two, but I got some criticism from some people who said, why is she writing about becoming a manager? Shouldn't she be writing about becoming a leader? And that was all well and good. And I said, okay, that's a legitimate criticism. I think that I was really trying to understand, how do you move into a role? So the reason why I ended up writing about mentorship is because one of the things that I learned in doing this research is that these new managers relied on others to help them learn how to do the job. And it turned out often it was not their immediate boss. They often viewed their immediate boss as a threat to their development, interestingly enough. And they often went back to their first manager to say, this is what I don't know, help me with this, because I didn't want to be seen as promotion mistakes. The way these things came together was I didn't know what I was doing, and I had taken a job to do this thing that I didn't know anything about. And then as I began to see how people actually learn to lead, I saw the importance of the mentors, sponsors, coaches. You need a whole network of relationships to help you learn how to do any new role, frankly.
When Dad was first captain in the Army, he was 19, he was parachuted in, he didn't know anything, but he was in a leadership role. He was called a leader. But there were people around him who had been there for a long time on the ground, relatively long time, months, whose job it was to educate them. That sounds a little bit like what you're talking about, that there are these roles that you're there to almost lead up and into this leader who has a different job description, but that there are people there to support them in that.
Well, I'm actually a daughter of an Army brat. One of the things that's very interesting about the military is that actually the sergeants also educate the junior officers. So, needless to say, the junior officer actually has more rank, but the sergeant usually has a lot more experience. So,
Yeah.
in fact, in the military, and actually the students who used to come to us from the military, I thought knew a lot more about management leadership than the ones who came to us from business, even though the business students always thought, what do those Army people know, or those military people? But because they, in fact, were in management roles or leadership roles and also worked with more diverse groups of people than the typical MBA at the time, they actually knew a lot more about it than the typical MBA who had not gone through the military. I don't know whether you've noticed, but the last two books that I've written, I've always had a co-author who starts with me when she is in her 20s, because I do think that one can learn a ton from people who are more junior to you. You can learn a ton from people with different perspectives, but I've always wanted to include, particularly as I've gotten older, someone who is a little younger and the different generation to go out and collect data with me and write with me. And I was talking to, actually, I think it was Fortune magazine, and I referred to it's always important to have a nuisance in your life. And I have two of these nuisances. So they were like, which one was the nuisance? I said I should have said nuisances because they really push back on you and they hold you accountable. So I personally feel that you can learn from lots of people and not paying attention too much to are they more senior, are they more junior to me? They have an important perspective. So I could not have written either book of the last two books without those two junior people. It turns out that they're both Emily's. So I have two co-authors that are ETs. The other one who's working with me now, is Lydia. And Lydia they're brilliant and they see the world differently and they try to help me know what's the latest and greatest that I should be thinking about or what their generation thinks about or whatever I'm writing.
It's so important. They call it a reverse mentoring, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
And it's really true. And Warren used to say all the time that in order to stay young and relevant, you have to have people in your life of all ages.
Yes.
If you're 80 in your 80s and you only hang around people in your 80s, you start to lose touch.
John Cotter wanted to start a book club. So we had a weekly book club, and Warren and John were the sponsors of it, and people would come to that. And I think the first book we read was Geeks and Geezers, and then we read a whole bunch of articles and other things. But that was a wonderful experience. John wanted it to be small, and we all had to commit to always coming to every meeting because he wanted it to be a conversation that we developed over time about important topics. So this group probably had, maybe I think 9 people or so.
Okay.
So this was quite intimate. Yeah.
What a room that must have been.
It was fun. Yeah.
I can't imagine. I would have loved to have recorded those conversations. We interviewed John recently too for this.
Oh,
Mhm.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that the listeners will get a sense of this community that Dad was involved with. Yeah. This interview is for two purposes. Number one, Betsy and I are writing a book, I hope, about this group of people who knew Dad and Dad's work. But also, and most importantly, it's for the University of Cincinnati, which is giving leadership training to 55,000 undergraduates based on Dad's work. And they will have access to this library of conversations for their work, for their research themselves. And they're young people. They're like as old as Dad was when he went to the Army. They're 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. And they're learning to be leaders. And you have done the research around that and managers. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your advice for kids that age. What does the data show, right? For the best ways to learn how to do this.
Can I give a slightly long answer?
Great.
Okay, because what I need to say, and also it's very much, I think, in some ways in your father's work. So I am actually an ethnographer, so I use the methods of anthropology to do my work. So it is qualitative work as well, but I tend to study an individual leader in his or her or their context for usually a minimum of 5 years because of what I'm interested in, which I'll come back to. So the reason I want to give this slightly larger answer is that where I started was looking at these individuals who were making this transition and talked about the identity shift. You have to change your professional identity or your sense of yourself, your professional identity, if you really want to shift to be a person who knows how to lead. So I finished that, and like with all things, when you finish a book, like a year or two later, I finally had the framework that really would capture what I wanted to say in some ways. And so, long story short, I wrote a second edition of Becoming a Manager, but that led to a book called Being the Boss, which we can come back to. Your father actually influenced me in choosing that title directly and indirectly. But what I learned from your father and from John is obviously, and if I look at your own father's work, it kind of went from, he starts on becoming a leader, which obviously you're always talking about who you're working with, to then the book that meant a lot to me was, I guess it's Organizing Genius. I hope I got the title right. And there he's looking at group, if you will. He's looking at the group piece. So I ended up writing Becoming a Manager and Being the Boss. In some sense, those two books go together. And I will come back to the advice I want to give from that point of view. Then I ended up, because the dean asked me at the time, Kim Clark, were we preparing leaders to lead innovation? And I first told him yes, and then again went to the library and realized that, you know what, the people who study innovation are mostly economists and macro sociologists, and so they don't really care about what the individual leader needs to do. So that led me on what's been almost a 25, I think it has been 25-year journey to try to look at the intersection of leadership and innovation. So the reason I'm saying this to you is that I ended up having to reconceive how I thought about leadership, because most people really do accept your father's definition of leadership about sort of dealing with change, having a vision, communicating that vision, and inspiring people to want to fulfill that vision. When I began to study what I refer to as exceptional leaders of innovation, Collective Genius, and now a book that's coming out called Genius at Scale, what I ended up seeing when you look at leading innovation specifically is the first leader I interviewed was Ed Catmull at Pixar. And I interviewed a lot of other leaders. But fundamentally, what these leaders told me is that leading innovation is different from leading change. And so I was very unsettled by this. And many of them actually said to me, I have no vision. The only reason I took this job is I don't know what the answer is at all. People better not try to follow me. And so this was very unsettling, given two of my mentors. And what they talked about was really purpose. Now, your father also wrote about purpose. So what they said is, I have a purpose, I have a why, I know what question I'm trying to answer, what opportunity, what challenge I'm trying to address, but it's not about followership. It's not about follow me to the future. It's about co-create the future with me. So what I write about now, and you need to be able to lead change, and when you have the vision, tell people, have them follow you, right? But often, as one of the leaders I write about in my current book, he said, you often feel like you're leading through a fog. And how do you lead when you have no vision, when you cannot see, right? So the first thing I would say to them is, you know what? There are lots of different functions you have to fulfill when you're a leader. And you are going to have to execute, you're going to have to deal with complexity, deal with change, and you're going to have to deal with innovation. So change and innovation are a little different. So I ended up coming up with a different way of thinking about leadership. And for me, it's about three imperatives. And I mix leadership and management in ways that John and or your father wouldn't be so happy about. But I don't think they're wrong. I think they're right. And so sometimes people write, oh, Linda says they're wrong. No, if you're leading change, exactly what they've said. And all of the leaders I've studied in terms of leading innovation have been visionaries, but they don't see their role as creating a vision. They see their role as creating an environment so that people will be willing and able to co-create the future with them. And co-creation is about collaboration, experimentation, and learning together. And so that process is what innovation is about. So in talking with young people, there are a couple things I would say if they want to be an effective leader. There are lots of different challenges. And I first want you to think about the fact that you are maybe, if you're, I mean, I usually write about leadership more than leaders in some ways, but when you are given the opportunity to be a leader, there are not only rights and privileges that come with that, but there are duties and obligations. Hence, I call the book Being the Boss. Particularly if you're someone's boss, you need to own that. And you need to understand those duties and obligations that come with being a boss. And then I would say to them, one way to think about everything you need to do is to think about sort of three imperatives that you have to be able to manage. The first one, you have to be able to manage yourself. You are trying to use yourself as an instrument to get things done. So you need to be self-aware enough so that you can actually begin to figure out, how do I match my intent with my impact? And that is really hard. That's at the heart. And all of leadership is emotional. So think about that. How are you making people feel? How do people experience you? How do they experience themselves when they're with you? The second imperative is managing your network. And this is about managing all of those parties over whom you have no formal authority, but you're deeply dependent on for you and your team to do your job. So some of those people are going to be inside, your peers and your bosses. Some of those people are going to be outside, customers, regulators, suppliers, maybe community activists, lots of different parties that you are really dependent on to get done what you need to get done. And then the third imperative is actually managing your team, or managing those people over whom you do have formal authority. Now, these are all very interrelated, and it does start with the self, and that's something your father helped us know too. Integrity, your purpose, your why, all of these things in all of your father's books, you see that. So you start with yourself. Being self-aware is not the same as being able to self-manage. This is lifetime work. The network piece, many people don't really think of that as being about leadership. It is totally about leadership. And you need to learn how to exercise leadership when you do not have formal authority, i.e., influence different diverse parties, even though you have no formal authority, which even very senior executives don't like to be in those positions, but that's the way of the world. And there's lots more. And that's actually how you get power. And what we know is if you are powerless, powerlessness is corrupting. So you want to have power, you want to be effective, but the way you really do that is that you build the relationships with people so that those people want to help you get access to the resources that you and your team are going to need to be effective. So when you're managing that network, you're really managing the context within which your team is going to have to work, figuring out what your priorities will be, because you understand the different priorities, constraints of these parties that you're interdependent with. Figuring out how can you convince and influence them to give you access to the resources. And the last piece about your team, there's a whole lot there. But the thing about the team part, again, learn from your father and others, but your father too, is that really when you're managing your team, you don't really want to be relying on formal authority as the way that you influence them. And frankly, formal authority does not work at all, or hardly at all, when you're trying to get people to innovate. You can only invite people to innovate. You can't force them to. So there, it's really about, you know what? Even though you're the boss, that's not the source of power you primarily want to be relying on to influence people. And so there, I really would say to them, first off, make sure you develop expertise, because that's the source of power you should mostly be using. You actually know what you're talking about. But really, you got to think about, how do I create an environment in which these individuals can do their best work, and that they move from being, if you will, on the team or in the group to working as a team. And those are all very hard. So to me, I would say those are those three imperatives. But while you're young and you're already leading, probably, remember that the work starts with yourself. And it's not about formal authority, really, even though that's what people almost immediately go to. The distinction between management and leadership, dealing with complexity, dealing with change. And most positions now, even really low-level leadership positions, they're pretty complex already, because we have organizations that have all these matrices or networks or whatever you have to think about. So yeah, if you don't know how to think through how to structure matters, how much structure to have, all the different systems that need to be put in place, you may inherit those as opposed to be able to design them when you first start out in your career. But you need to understand what the impact of those can be on why people are behaving the way they are. And sometimes these are constraints for you that you're going to work in, and you would have designed it differently, but you do need to be able to think really think systemically about what are the signals that people are getting from our talent systems, from the way we're structured, et cetera. And if some of these may not be as aligned with where we need to go these days, some of that I might need to make sure my bosses understand that and have the appropriate influence there. And other times I might need to be, I don't know, balance out those impacts, but be aware of them as I think about how I use myself as an instrument to balance those out. And how does my own style impact or interact with those formal systems?
I want to go back to one of the things you said at the very beginning, which I'm still fascinated by. You think that there's a lot of nurture that goes into leadership, not just learning it. So dad's whole thing was you're
Yeah,
not born that way, you learn it. And you're
right.
adding this other element, which is context of the leader. What is the fertile ground that that person has that either creates a leader, regardless of what they learn or read,
Right.
right? Or study. And I remember dad did an interview of John Gardner in Geeks and Geezers. John Gardner had been a professor, I think, of English at Mount Holyoke or something. And then Kennedy tapped him to be the Secretary of Education. And he said that I was waiting for the world to pull something out of me I didn't know that I had. And that really reminds me of what you were talking about. And actually, I'm working with a leader right now who runs a huge national nonprofit. And he said, we keep looking for the next great leaders, but leaders are born of movements. Can you speak to that a little bit about how can we create that fertile soil? I feel like right now we're living in an age of a lot of strife and conflict. And one good thing is that that's a fertile soil for creating great leaders, maybe. Let's hope. So, can you talk a little bit about that distinction you make between the nurture and the learning?
I mean, one of the things that your father's research, and it's been found to be true by others, is that these crucible experiences really shape us. And so usually there's a little adversity in there that gets our attention and leads us to be open to development. So I did say when I mentioned innovation, I said willing and able. There's the willing and the able piece, right? Are you willing to work on yourself? Are you able to work on yourself? When we first heard about EQ or emotional intelligence, that was quite a new concept. And I think that was maybe the late 80s. So then it was like, oh, I'm supposed to have EQ. Well, the other thing that will add to this is we now talk about CQ or contextual intelligence. And we work very hard to help the MBAs and executives develop their contextual intelligence. So I think that the micro and the macro in a way and how you bring those together. But going back to the nurturing environment, we need to have a constellation of relationships to help us learn. And actually, Jolene's case is about that. So, what I wrote about, and I want to be careful not to blame the victim, but one of the things we wrote about in this note on Beyond the Myth of the Perfect Mentor, and I called it that because the MBAs used to come to me and say, oh, when I get my job, I'm going to get myself a mentor, whatever. And I would say, your mother wouldn't do all that for you, and they're already paying you tons of money. Why would anyone do this for you? So, we wanted to write about what do you need to do if you want to attract people who want to help you develop and create that nurturing. And what needs to happen? How do you need to behave? How do you think about these people who are willing to do this? What are the various roles you need them to fulfill? So a part of that is about reciprocity. That if someone does something for you, and I don't mean in a tit for tat way, you need to think about what can I give to them? They're being generous. So how do you be generous back? And what those mentors are going to want. They're not all the same. But one thing to think about, these are relationships. These are relationships that will probably evolve. These are relationships that can be quite complicated, frankly, particularly as you grow up. And will they even see that you've grown up? Just like I'm trying to let my 23-year-old grow up instead of be my baby. So you got to be prepared. These are dynamic and no one's perfect. And the reason I wanted to say I don't want to blame the victim, we do know that people who are in the minority in various ways and environments have more trouble attracting mentors, sponsors, advisors, etc. So I don't want to blame the victim. But one of the things that someone said about Jolene when we interviewed her colleagues, a very senior person said, I send her out to go fishing for a flounder and she brings me back a whale. Now that person wanted those whales. And he thought, wow, I do this little thing and I get all this back. But some mentors who don't want the whale, right, might give you a sense, okay, let's make this into a flounder now. But it was one of the things that kept getting said about her is people loved to mentor her because they weren't exactly sure what they would get back, but they knew whatever it was, it would be special and different. And she would throw her all into it. And so she attracted many people who were open to developing her. And she then knew how to take advantage of those opportunities. There is something about the culture of the place, but it also relates to how you carry yourself. Are you open? Are you curious? What do you do if someone gives you feedback that you don't like? Which might be any negative feedback, because none of us really like to get negative feedback. But if you become defensive and they have to pay for that, then they're not going to give you feedback again. So these are about two-way relationships. Some of the dynamics are not the fairest, particularly if you are in the minority, and we do think about that a lot and write about that. But I do think that Jolene was obviously a woman. She's was a younger woman compared to the men who she was being mentored by. And she's a force of nature, but as you know her, she's a fairly small person.
Yeah.
She takes up a lot of space, right? So I think that writing about her is an example of how in Polaroid, and she's not, she wasn't an engineer, she was a social worker, how she used what she had to help the organization and how individual people wanted to work with her, either senior peers or people who are more junior than her, because it was an exciting opportunity to work on some of what she was working on. She sort of helps create that nurturing environment. It's just not there or given to her. Although I think Polaroid was a place that was known for being open-minded and giving people opportunity.
Interesting. That's how Warren got into Polaroid, right, Kate? As a consultant to them?
A consultant, and he met Jolene and he invited her into the leadership meetings immediately. I think she was 24 or 5, something like that.
Yeah.
He
He said,
became
"You
a
should come to
mentor.
the leadership meetings." And she said, "Okay."
And he mentored her.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a great example,
But
Linda.
he
Of,
included her in the same way, Linda, you include these young authors to have those other perspectives. Dad always included the students at the universities. He was bringing them to the budgeting meetings because he thought they needed to learn about budgeting. He brought them to meet every luminary. He would say, "These are the students." I just was speaking to the sisters of one of our old babysitters who just died tragically. And Michael Shore, the babysitter, used to say, "Yeah, I'd be babysitting." And your dad would say, "Come and sit with us and meet Margaret Mead and Jonas Salk." And he just invited everybody in because he felt like those connections and that creates a fertile environment for nurturing leadership, right?
Yeah.
Connecting to these people and not having it be exclusive.
Yep. And then also making relatively big bets on people, giving them interesting opportunities. I was so excited. I was with a group of people helping NASA become more innovative. And this was in the 2017, 2000, somewhere in there. And apparently NASA had sort of lost its way with regard to innovation, partly because of generational issues. If you think back to then, we've become a little bit more excited about space again, but we weren't paying attention to space very much. And partly they obviously had those tragedies. And the people who grew up during the tragedy time, as opposed to the time before that, when they were very beloved, had become risk averse. They brought in all these people I really loved who I got to work with, these very esteemed scholars and people in business who were really good at innovation. They said they didn't know how to work with young people, and they were beginning to lose young people to SpaceX, et cetera, who could pay more exciting, worked at a different pace. So I said, okay, so for my workshop that I'm going to do, I'm going to have two of my young people actually run the workshop because you said you want to learn how to work with young people. And these are two very capable young people. And one of them was Allison and one of the Emilys. And they agreed to it, but as we got closer to the time, they became extremely nervous about it. So I ended up asking a former student who actually was the person who ended up running the Pfizer vaccines in 266 days. So really good. I know he loves NASA. So I said, I know this is very last minute, but could you possibly go with these two young women? Because I'm beginning to think that I've kind of set them up because I wasn't going to be there. And he went. Anyway, long story short, they got the highest rating of all of the sessions done by all of these very fed. And it was partly because I think they approached it differently because they were younger. It was fresh, it was different. But Michael was there too, who's also very capable, to give them legitimacy and also to fill in blanks that they wouldn't be able to fill in because by that time he wasn't executive himself. He was a middle manager in Pfizer at that point. You are taking a risk, but I didn't really see it as a risk, but I thought NASA did see it as a risk, a much bigger risk than I did. So you have to step back and say, what's their context going to be?
When you describe that whole situation to me, that sounds like the best leadership. Because I feel in some cases, in the best therapy, the best facilitation, the best moderation, the best acting is when you feel like the person who's supposed to be the leader in that position of authority is almost invisible. And in this case, you were. You were not
Right.
even present. But it is leadership, true leadership with vision for the context, what they needed and what they didn't know they need. They didn't know they needed the young people, and they needed the person there to give it validity and weight. And you were able to see all of this and to be literally invisible yourself in the space, but you were there. You helped them train. That to me says something about a kind of leadership that I respect so deeply. I coach leaders and they'll say, well, I'd love to be like so and so the way he runs a meeting. He never says anything, but they go so smoothly. There's something
Mm.
about that invisible leadership that I'm fascinated by because it's actually very powerful.
Yeah, when you've really created the environment and they know what they're supposed to be doing and you intervene only when you need to. I still have a lot of learning to do about that, which is partly why I sent them by themselves.
Yeah.
I thought I could very easily find myself dominating or behaving in ways that would not allow them to shine the way they should. So it was important that I wasn't there because of my own capacity or lack thereof to be in that context, frankly. So you have to really understand your own limitations.
That's really true. Easy to
Yeah,
jump in when there's moments of uncomfortableness or silence,
right.
right? Instead of giving the capacity for them to figure it out.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
what's interesting, Linda, is what you were talking about, the contextual intelligence, because that's a piece that Warren was really keen on.
Well, actually, Tony Mayo, who was the director of the Leadership Initiative, he writes about it. And he and Nitin wrote a book on great US leaders. Tony's now doing one looking across the world as opposed to just the US. But they found that what leaders really became great really related to the context within which they were working, the zeitgeist even. Then there's another professor, Tarun Khanna, who does a lot of work in emerging markets, who began to study, if you build a profitable business here, will it be profitable in another country? And he was particularly looking at emerging market kinds of settings, companies who were created in the developed world, who then went to go to the emerging market world, or whatever language we're using to describe this these days. So the way it's showing up in my own work now, and I was just talking to my research director. We all have research directors, and every 5 years, tenured professors have to write up what they're going to do for the next 5 years. We were chatting, and in our new book, which is really about how do you scale innovation, specifically, we really look at this question of scaling and different definitions of scaling. But the last part of the book, and it also goes back to the young people, the last part of the book is on what we call catalyst leadership. So the book is about the ABCs of leading innovation. The A role is architect, the B role is bridger, the C role is catalyst. And catalysts are leaders who know how to build innovative ecosystems. And I have the absolute privilege of recently joining the board of the Kresge Foundation, thanks to one of my former students. And we do place philanthropy. We have certain cities, Detroit, New Orleans, Fresno, Memphis. So these are ecosystems. Here's a younger person giving me an opportunity to be on the board of this foundation. And what it's about is how do we create movements across an ecosystem, movements of people, of stakeholders who want to innovate. And in this instance, for Kresge, it's to reinvigorate Detroit, for instance. What we look at in the last part of our book are all about leaders who are serving as catalysts, who are creating movements across ecosystems, which you need to do even to sell a lot of EVs, electric vehicles. You need partnerships and stakeholders, coalitions across private, public, all of it to actually do that properly. One of the things we talk about is how do you map out an ecosystem? Sometimes the ecosystem's there already, other times you're really creating it. And one of the most interesting ones we have is of two Japanese engineers who were in individual contributor roles at ANA, the Japanese airline, and had an idea to create a global platform for transportation without the mass. And when they went to see the CEO about this, these are two engineers. They wanted to ANA to go into the mobility business and figure out how can we get resources to everyone in the world that they need, and in a way that you don't have to tear down the forest. So they had this idea of, can we create avatar robots where you're sitting wherever you are, but you're sending your five senses through this global platform, and there's this avatar robot in that town or that whatever that community is, and you can send, if you need physicians, whatever you need, you can send yourself. So when they went to the CEO, imagine two individual contributor engineers who work out at the airport. They come up with this wild idea. Interestingly, they both went to Montessori schools, which is unusual in Japan. They go and they tell the CEO, and he said, "You mean teleportation like in Star Trek?" And they said, "Yeah, but we talked to the quantum physicists, but it's going to be 50 years before we can send the human body, but we can send the five senses." Now, I'm here to tell you they have gotten millions of dollars from ANA, the government of Japan, and others to create these avatarian robots. And again, it's your consciousness, right? As they said, we want human consciousness and your senses. So you can actually send, not so well, smell across the internet now. So they're working with people all over the world to create this. So going back to these ecosystems, so they're creating, and they said this is a movement. We want everyone in the movement, and we're going to figure out how to have shared intention to get this done. But they have to map out. They're building an ecosystem, right, to get this
Wow.
done. So they've mapped it out, and this requires tremendous contextual intelligence. But as Tony found out, and as Tarun found out, you don't really develop contextual intelligence until you start to do the work. You plan, but until you go out there and try to get to do it, you just go, oh no, this is the group that we got to really get on board. And they do call it a movement. And all of the people who we write about in part 3 of Genius and Scale, they're creating movements. Another one is a food justice movement across Africa. Of course, you have no formal authority in these situations. So how do you catalyze others to want to collaborate, experiment, and learn together and address really big opportunities or challenges? I was sitting on a panel with one of the founders. They were in the innovation lab, I believe. Yes. And I heard him. I thought, well, who is this crazy person two places down who's really interesting? I was on a panel in Japan. So I went over and talked to him. This was now probably 8 years ago. In fact, I'm going to go see them again soon. So I do try to stick with my leaders, mostly because if you're trying to do something big and important, it takes time. And if you're trying to transform the culture of a large organization, I've never seen them change in less than 5 years. So I have found that I need to try my best to stick around if I'm really going to see this process unfold.
I love this idea that you not only take note and learn the context, the culture of this organization, this group, this moment in history, and then you create the context. This idea of being proactive,
Mhm.
something that you seem to talk about. And Dad
Yep.
talked about that a lot. And when you talked about Jolene, I can see now why he adored Jolene so much because she would bring a whale. And some people don't like that.
They don't, yeah, your father would want the whale,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
And the
bring the whale.
people,
What
yeah.
that means is that you're trusting the people to do the work, see what needs to happen, do it big,
Mhm.
rather than trying to keep things safe, guarded, controlled. To really allow something to flourish means we have to let go of a lot of that and trust the people that we're leading.
This is something that I believe, so I won't just say I think your father was very good at. Because your father has points of view. I mean, obviously he's a visionary and he wrote a lot of things before other people wrote about them. And one of the things I heard was some visionaries don't know how to make space for other visionaries. If you're a big V visionary, do you know how to make space for other people to bring their vision in? And some can and some can't. And what we need are more visionaries who actually can make space for other visionaries. So I had the absolute crazy privilege by accident to get to spend a little bit of time with President Mandela, who was a big V, right, visionary. But everyone I met who was in prison with him, and that's the group that I ended up spending most of the time in the same hallway with him, they all talked about how he just didn't take up all the space. And that is one of the things I think is very unique. And I think your father didn't take up all the space.
No.
So I think that capacity of self-management, when you could actually take up all the space, you're humble enough to know that anyway. But your father made space. And that is what is I think, one of the most precious gifts. I have to tell you, I'm feeling a little choked up because Jay Lorsch recently passed away too, who is someone who was quite a mentor of mine. And Jay and Warren would have very interesting conversations when Warren was with us for those 2 years. And that's why I said, in some ways, your father, he's still with me. I don't think about him in the past tense very often. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. And I'm so excited for your book. And I want to
Thank
go
you.
back and read the previous book, Collective Genius.
Hopefully you'll enjoy it. I got really lucky. By accident, I met the man who was fundamentally, he didn't really don't have titles like this, the chief technology officer of Pixar, who I wrote Collective Genius with. And now I'm working with someone on digital matters, and she was the head of production for Disney Animation, then went over to Weta. She's so wonderful. We're talking about all this stuff, and she has 7 Academy Awards, right? That she has won. You would love Anne too. But I always think you want to have fun people to be around. May as well enjoy life.
Absolutely.
Linda, I just poked on an article that was written about Brene Brown that you were quoted.
Oh,
They talked about your title and said, Linda, who studies digital transformation, will tell you the hardest thing about digital transformation is never the technology, it's always the people. So that was really interesting that you brought it back to people, which is what we're
yeah.
trying to do here.
She is so lovely. But they put my name as Linda Hall. They corrected it. If you go to the
Oh,
bottom, I was on her podcast, had a lovely conversation, and I hadn't done my homework enough, so I didn't know she was going to ask me what music I couldn't live without. She asked these questions at the end that I was not prepared for. When this happened, she said, she sent me this note. She said, "It's wrong. Your name is wrong. You read the book and I know your name." And so she had them corrected. I have to say, she's one of my favorite interviews ever, I would say. She's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was like, oh, my favorite music. What music could I? No, it's what music could you not live without? So
Oh,
think
I
on
have
that
mine.
one.
I know mine
yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So see you all, and thank you for your patience. It's
Thank
just
you,
been wacky.
Linda. This has
Okay.
been a pleasure and a treasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.